And if you wanted to have a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, then these were the perfect weapons to deploy because the instability regime created would inevitably spin out of control.
By Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, sell them to NATO, and let them sell them to Ukraine.
Yeah, I've sort of made a decision, pretty much. If you consider, yeah, I think I want to find out what they're doing with them.
Yes.
You know, where are they sending them? I guess I'd have to ask that question.
Sending Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine would mark a major escalation, shifting the conflict from primarily defensive aid to deep strike capabilities. Politically, it signals Washington's readiness to let Kyiv hit targets far beyond the front lines, including inside Russia, which Moscow views as a direct threat to its strategic security. The risks include severe Russian retaliation, possible strikes on NATO logistics hubs, and the blurring of proxy war boundaries. The move raises the chance of widening the war regionally, drawing in more direct East-West confrontation. In addition, sending Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine meaningfully raises the nuclear risk. Now let's see what Scott Ritter has to say about this daring move.
Well, the Tomahawk is there's three variants of it that were made. There's an air-launched variant, there's a sea-launched variant, and then there's a ground-launched variant. The ground-launched variant was deployed to Europe back in the early 1980s as part of the counter force strategy taken by the United States to offset the Soviet deployment of the SS-20 intermediate range nuclear missile, road mobile. The SS-20 was seen as changing the balance of power in Europe, giving the Soviets tremendous amount of advantage, and we needed to counter it. So we deployed two systems: the Pershing II, which is a solid rocket missile, very capable, very accurate, and we also deployed the ground launch cruise missile, the Tomahawk. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed because what the world recognized is that these weapon systems of intermediate range were extraordinarily destabilizing, especially when deployed in Europe. And if you wanted to have a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, then these were the perfect weapons to deploy because the instability regime created would inevitably spin out of control. So President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev wisely, in December of 1987, signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. It went into force in July of 1988, and we got rid of them, eliminated them. The air-launched variant was still there. I know it very well. During the Gulf War in 1991, the first combat use of the air-launched cruise missile was used to strike initially the Taji Iraqi missile production facility. And there was the sea-launched version, which everybody has seen fired from ships and come out of the water from submarines. And it, again, played a very important role in the early moments of Desert Storm and just about every American military operation since. But the ground-launched version was gone, eliminated, until Donald Trump decided that he was going to pull out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which he did in August of 2019, citing a manufactured case. At least that's my assessment, the case that we made against the Russians, that they were fielding a system, the 9M729. We claim to have intermediate range in excess of 500 miles. And the Russians denied it, did their best to try and prove otherwise, but we pulled out because we wanted to pull out. And the reason why I wanted to pull out is that we wanted to deploy the Tomahawk in a ground-launched variety. Within weeks of pulling out, we did the first test of the ground-launched Tomahawk, fired from what's called a Mark 41 pod, Aegis Ashore, the same system that's used on ships and also used, by the way, in Poland and in Romania as part of their so-called ballistic missile defense shield. Can also launch missiles like the Tomahawk that are ground attack missiles. And so here we are. It's back in system. It is not I mean, there is a nuclear variant. Obviously, we're not providing that to anybody, except maybe the British, but even then, I don't think so. Um, but the Tomahawk's best known for its conventional payload, its ability to, strike accurately over long distances. But it's a hyped up system. I'll just be honest with you. There's certain things that I'm allowed to talk about and certain things I'm not allowed to talk about. One of the things I'm still not allowed to talk about is the accuracy of the Tomahawk during Desert Storm. You can put two and two together as to maybe why they wouldn't want to talk about the specific effectiveness of that system. But we have even though they've improved the Tomahawk over time in terms of improved guidance, taking advantage of new technologies. When the Tomahawk was used against Syria, and again by Donald Trump and another hyped up thing, it didn't perform well. The majority of them were shot down or missed their targets. The Tomahawk's just not a very good system. And you need a lot of Tomahawks to destroy a facility. Again, I mentioned the Taji missile facility north of Baghdad for a reason, because we blanketed it with Tomahawks, scores of them, and we never fully destroyed it. Um, so it's a system that has some capability, but when it comes to actual physical destruction um, of facilities, it's just not that effective. We fired 35 of them most recently against Iran, I believe, targeting missile sites in Isfahan, or nuclear sites in Isfahan, with little or no effect. Um, so here's that system. It's now up for export. The United States, always looking to make a penny, has decided that it wants to export the Tomahawk. Before, I think ourselves and the British were the only ones who used it. Now the talk is to send it to Japan and the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is the important party here because, as you have indicated, the Tomahawk wouldn't be provided directly by the United States to Ukraine. It would be sent through a European intermediary, through a NATO country. And the Dutch have, been, I mean, they have, I think, concluded a contract. They've done their operational testing. A Tomahawk has been fired from a Dutch frigate. And the Dutch are in line to buy a couple of hundred of these things. Delivery expected to begin in 2028. And so when we talk about providing the Tomahawk to Ukraine, it would be through a European intermediary, and the Dutch seem to be the most likely candidates because they're the only European power besides the British to to be purchasing the Tomahawk. Any other European nation coming up, you'd have to get in line. And Ukrainians would never see that weapon system. But this is where we're at. It can reach out and touch people 1,500 miles accurately. But as President Putin mentioned in Valdai, the very discussion group we were at, it's an old system, and they can shoot it down, and it's not a game changer. It really isn't a game changer, unless it strikes political targets. I mean, as a weapon system to degrade, the only reason why Ukraine would want this is to, for instance, you see a lot of talk now about using the Tomahawk or a Tomahawk-like system to take out the drone production facility near Kazan. You would need to take out that facility effectively. You would need over 60 Tomahawk missiles to strike that facility. It isn't going to be done with one or two. You would need 60, and even then, there's no guarantee. To strike other facilities, for instance, if you want to take out the Vodkinsk missile assembly plant, where the Russians are pumping out the Iskander-S's, they're pumping out the Oreshnik, they're pumping out other systems, strategic as well. You would probably have to strike that facility with well over 100 Tomahawks. And even then, there's no guarantee of success. It's just not that effective of a system.
Mr. Ritter, do you believe that sending Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine crosses the line from a proxy conflict into direct U.S. involvement? In your view, would this kind of escalation inevitably lead to American boots on the ground in Ukraine? Or at least bring the U.S. into a role indistinguishable from a direct participant in the war?
Glenn, with all due respect, we've crossed that line already. We are at war with Russia. We just don't acknowledge it. But it's a war. The Russians know this. They've made statements to that effect. And even Marco Rubio says we are in a proxy war with Russia. That's a war. We are direct participants in this conflict, and we have been for some time now. Um, the Tomahawk, however, would be literally a bridge too far. First of all, it's a nuclear capable system. The deterrent factor that it had back in the 1980s wasn't because it delivered a conventional payloads, because it delivered a nuclear payload. During the Cold War, when the Tomahawk was first deployed to Europe in a ground launch version, um, it was a nuclear capable system, and that's what made it so dangerous. And it could be used to participate in a first strike. There was actually a plan in place to use the Pershing II to decapitate Soviet leadership, command and control. And then the Tomahawk combined with Trident missiles launched from Ohio-class submarines operating close to shore on a reduced trajectory would seek to destroy as much of the Soviet nuclear missiles as possible to create an inevitability of defeat, classic first strike. This has made it so destabilizing, and that's why the decision was made to get rid of them. But now when you have to ask yourself, if you're a Russian and you see a Tomahawk being fired at you from Ukraine or from anywhere, how do you know it's not nuclear? How do you know it's not part of this decapitation? If you go back to December of 2021, when the Russians were talking to the Biden administration about Ukraine, the Russians made it clear over and over again that the one thing that they worried about more than anything else was NATO long-range missiles based on Ukrainian soil. You see, Ukraine is like a fist in the Russian womb. Um, all the Russian strategic infrastructure was, designed during Soviet times and placed during Soviet times when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And so, where the Russian facilities are and capabilities are, bases are, was considered to be part of a strategic depth. It would take some effort to get from, NATO countries through the Warsaw Pact into the Soviet depth. Because remember, it wasn't just Ukraine, but you had the whole buffering states of Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany. They all provided a buffer too in terms of space. And now NATO expansion has brought NATO right up to the Russian borders. And now with Ukraine, you just come in and literally all of the Russian strategic depth is now exposed. And the Russians said, we can't allow NATO to put long-range strike capabilities in there. And the Biden administration would not commit to not doing this. So literally the Tomahawk is the Russian nightmare coming true. And the Russian nuclear doctrine is quite specific that if a non-nuclear state is empowered by a nuclear state to strike Russia, then Russia will treat it as an attack by a nuclear state and respond with the full capacity of its capabilities, which is nuclear. And so we need to acknowledge right up from the start that any use by Ukraine of Tomahawk missiles would bring about a possible Russian nuclear response, especially if they struck political targets. Could you imagine a Tomahawk missile hitting the Kremlin, hitting St. Basil's, hitting the Bolshoi Theater, hitting St. Petersburg? Imagine what would happen if the Russians provided caliber missiles to Venezuela, and then the Venezuelans fired them, and they struck the Capitol, they struck the White House, they struck the Smithsonian. You think the United States would go, oh, well, it's just war? Or would we not only eliminate Venezuela forever, but probably eliminate the Russians as well for facilitating this attack? Because I would imagine that the caliber missile could not be fired without assistance, targeting assistance, technical assistance from Russian technicians. The question now is, can that Tomahawk be operated by Ukraine, without assistance? The version of the Tomahawk that the United States employs that has access to satellites, GPS satellites, radar satellites, imaging satellites that provides real-time updates. This cannot be operated by anybody other than Americans, because first of all, the communications systems are all heavily encrypted. and the keen material is closely guarded secret, protected by the National Security Agency and other defense security agencies, and it will not be shared with anybody. These are the most closely held secrets in the United States, and so. And the other thing is the packaging. For instance, the terrain following technology. That strike package, the mapping, is prepared by a special American Department of Defense activity that uses American intelligence information to do this, and that nobody else in the world can replicate that. So if you're using Terracom, that means you're using American intelligence specifically configured for the target that you're striking, which means America is now targeting Russia, in effect. The same thing with the GPS. It's military-grade GPS, which is in encrypted communications. If you used commercial-grade GPS, the Russians would jam it. The missile would be stupid. And then finally, the final guidance that goes in is imaging matching. Images are stored inside the Tomahawk, and then as it comes in, it scans and it's looking for a match, and it finds the match and then does the final maneuver to hit the target. That's again imagery provided by the United States system. Again, that cannot operate without the United States. So the American version of the Tomahawk could not be provided to Ukraine without the Americans running the whole show. I mean, maybe a Ukrainian finger would push the launch button, but everything else would be the United States. So it would be the United States literally attacking Russia.